The Demon of Florence, Chapter 3. Enter Machiavelli. Machiavelli stumbled. One of the guards had shoved him as he tried to slow the pace between his prison cell and the dungeon where he'd be tortured. Machiavelli knew that on one level, walking slowly wasn't logical. The guards would inevitably get him to that chamber one way or another. But even a slight delay of a few moments was preferable to what was about to happen. Perhaps, he hoped, that in those few extra seconds, someone would come to rescue him. But he knew such hopes were foolish. He had sent dozens of letters to every nobleman, merchant, politician, bureaucrat, and army captain he had ever met, and none of them had lifted a finger to help him. Well, he really didn't know if they'd attempted to help him or not. In fact, he had no way of knowing whether any of his letters had actually gotten through. But each time the guards tied his wrists together behind his back, he looked to the dungeon entrance, hoping that someone would send word that he had been freed. But when the tall but portly Commandant Collana walked in, grinning ear to ear, Machiavelli knew his fate. Commandant Collana always wore a bright yellow uniform that was unusually clean for someone who spent his days in a prison. Machiavelli had come to despise the color yellow, as he locked eyes with the smiling Commandant. A year ago, he wouldn't have given such a common man a second thought. But now, Collana had absolute dominion over him, whether he ate, drank, slept, lived, or died. Power was a fickle mistress. Machiavelli had always known this, and yet he played the game. He had played the game well and risen to the heights of power. But in an instant, it had all come crashing down. Florence had an alliance with the French against Pope Julius II, but when the French were driven from Italy, they left Florence vulnerable to her enemies, and the wealthy Medici family marched right in. "Are you sure you do not wish to confess?" Machiavelli knew a confession meant immediate execution, so he said nothing. "Very well, then." The guards placed a hook onto the straps that bound his wrists together behind his back. The hook was connected to a pulley, which the guards would use to raise Machiavelli into the air. With each turn of the crank, he would be pulled higher, until his arms would be pulled so high behind his back that his shoulders would dislocate. Machiavelli was well acquainted with the strappado manner of torture. He just never thought it would happen to him. Perhaps that was his greatest mistake in politics. It always ends in tatters. The first 3 turns never did any real damage. In fact, pain could be avoided if one leaned forward and kept one's legs flexible. But by the 3rd turn of the crank, Machiavelli was standing on his tiptoes with no more room left to maneuver. Intense pain was coming and Collana knew it, which is why he was so smug. Collana leaned forward, his face mere inches from his victim. Machiavelli wanted to spit on Collana or bite his nose off, but that would inevitably cost him his own life. All he could do was vow that he would one day get revenge on the sadistic Commandant. Machiavelli wondered how much pain Collana could endure if the tables were suddenly turned. He knew only too well that it was very easy to give the orders to torture a man, but enduring it yourself... "Again! You conspired against the Lord of Florence. Confess!" Machiavelli had already given up all the useful information he could without admitting to full treason. "Please, Signor, if I could just speak with Lord Giuliano." "Why would he speak with the likes of you?" "I can explain. I could be a useful servant to his lordship." Machiavelli knew that the Medicis were ruthless, but Giuliano de' Medici, the new Lord of Florence, was gullible. All he needed was one conversation, and he knew he could... "Again!" "Please, I've told you everything. I would serve the Medicis." "You cannot talk your way out of this one, Chancellor." The commandant pulled out an apple and began eating it. Machiavelli could smell the sweetness of the fruit. The pain in his arms briefly gave way to hunger. He hadn't eaten properly in months. He'd kill Kalana for that apple if he could get away with it. But Kalana, seeing the hostility in his eyes, took another bite of the apple and waved his hands at the guards, who dutifully turned the crank. Ah! His right shoulder popped out of its socket, causing searing pain. Tears began to well in his eyes. His desire for vengeance instantly turned into a need to survive, to escape the searing pain in his arm. Please! He looked to the other guards, pleading with them for mercy, but they weren't even looking at him. One of them was staring out the window, and the other was picking his nose. Allow me to speak with anyone from the Medici family. Giovanni is wise. Let me— You can confess! Machiavelli knew he should remain tough, steely, but desperation was winning with every second his right shoulder remained in excruciating pain. What do you want from me? Just tell me what you want from me. Kalana's smile dissolved. Did he feel an ounce of pity? Let him down. The guards reversed the pulley, but Machiavelli fell to the ground with a thud. Machiavelli felt his ankle and knee hit the ground at the wrong angle, but the pain of a sprained ankle was nothing compared to the throbbing in his right shoulder. Fix his shoulder. One of the guards kneeled down and popped his shoulder back into its socket. The pain was searing, but he could feel it starting to lessen. Machiavelli gazed at Kalana in confusion. He hated him, but he couldn't help but feel a modicum of gratitude. This torture session had been much shorter than the previous 6. Perhaps Kalana wanted to see Machiavelli broken, the high-ranking official low, humbled and humiliated. Thank you, Commandant. You will be executed tomorrow. Gratitude instantly reverted to contempt. That was one of the games Kalana liked to play. You'll be executed tomorrow, next week, soon, very soon. Machiavelli had heard it all before. For a moment, he no longer wanted to appear broken. Forgive me, Signor, but you've been saying that for some time. He expected the guards to strap him back up, but Kalana only stared at him and smiled. Take him back to his cell. The guards did as they were instructed, and Kalana followed behind. Machiavelli reckoned that if he hadn't been executed by now, someone must be attempting to negotiate on his behalf. He allowed himself to dream that perhaps maybe one of his letters had somehow gotten through. Machiavelli entered his cell, and Kalana followed him in. The prisoner braced for a beating, but Kalana walked right past him and pointed through a small hole in the wall. It was too small to call a window, but it had served as Machiavelli's only link to the outside world. Machiavelli stepped on his tiptoes to see what Kalana was pointing at. His ankle instantly ached at having extra pressure placed on it, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. Machiavelli looked out, and at first, he saw men and women going up and down the streets, acting as if nothing were wrong. But then he saw the carpenters. He gasped in horror. Inside the nearby plaza, several carpenters were busy hammering away at a large wooden construction. They were busy constructing a makeshift set of gallows. The Medicis weren't intending to pardon him. They were going to execute him. Publicly. So he'd be an example to anyone else who might stand against them. He instantly became nauseous. If he had a full belly, he would have vomited it up in his cell. Kalana's wide smile now revealed all of his crooked teeth. Contempt gave way to the will to live. Machiavelli dropped to his feet to beg for mercy. Kalana was enjoying his terror, but the prisoner knew this man didn't have an ounce of mercy in him. Machiavelli looked around and saw the most recent letter he had written. He grabbed it and pressed it to Colana's chest. "Please, Signor, you must deliver this letter. You cannot refuse my final request." Colana studied the letter for a moment, but crumpled it up and threw it behind his shoulder, outside Machiavelli's cell. "Sleep well tonight, Chancellor." As soon as they had left the cell block, Machiavelli instantly reached through the bars towards the crumpled letter on the floor. He instinctively reached out with his right hand, but a sharp pain instantly ran from his shoulder to his fingertips, and he recoiled in pain. He reached with his other arm, but the paper was too far away, but he kept trying to extend his left arm. It was his final chance to escape this hell. The letter to the mysterious fixer who lived on the outskirts of Florence. Machiavelli lay on the floor for what seemed like hours, staring at the paper. He stared at it as if he could somehow will it to levitate and come to him. But he possessed no such powers of telekinesis. For a moment, exhaustion took over, and he lost consciousness. He awoke to the sound of the prison guard, making his rounds in the evening. This guard had not been one of the ones who had tortured him, so Machiavelli saw his chance. "Signor, may I ask, what is your name, Signor?" "Luca," the guard said suspiciously. "Signor Luca, could you pass me that piece of paper right there? By your foot, por favore." Luca picked up the paper and tried to read it, but he was clearly oblivious to the fact that the letter was upside down. An illiterate fool, he thought to himself. But this was his chance. His arm was still throbbing in pain. He was starving and exhausted. But easier than one might crumple a piece of paper, Machiavelli began crafting a lie. He knew it had to be enticing enough to manipulate this guard, but it must not be too obvious or desperate. It would need to be disguised as an opportunity. "Signor, is the other guard, Flavio, is he here tonight?" "Flavio? That's Stronzo. He's always licking Colana's boots." Machiavelli resisted the urge to smirk at the guard's apparent hatred for his colleague, but he knew how to exploit such emotions all too easily. "Oh, well, I wish I had known. I'm not sure who's going to receive his share of the gold." "What gold?" Machiavelli looked around, pretending to be cautious about being overheard. "Tell me, Luca, can you keep a secret?" The guard leaned in, and Machiavelli began to spin his web. And as he saw the guard nodding along, Machiavelli knew that he was still in the game. This has been Chapter 3 of The Demon of Florence by Andrew L. Productions. It was performed by Elliot Crossley. If you've enjoyed this broadcast, please do like and subscribe to the channel, and please feel free to leave us a comment or follow us on social media. Thank you.